They say the snow erases all tracks, but that winter in the Utah Territory of 1847, it erased something far worse. 4 women, bound by marriage and belief, disappeared into silence. No footprints, no trail. Only the trembling testimony of a man who claimed God had spoken through his dreams. Ezekiel Whitmore was not a man of weak constitution. He was a builder, a settler, and above all, a believer. But belief, unchecked and isolated, can mutate. It can birth something more powerful than faith. It can birth obsession. And in that valley of wind and frost, obsession took root, one wife at a time. By the time spring came, the only thing more chilling than the melted snow was what it revealed beneath, and the only thing more disturbing than the physical evidence was the theology behind it. What the church found buried under the very foundation of its new meeting house in 1920 was not just bone and cloth. It was ideology, ritual, written in the language of sacrifice. The kind of doctrine never meant for the public eye, the kind that was hidden away in sealed archives, only whispered about in the darkest corners of the early church. This isn't just a mystery of missing women. It's not even just a story of madness. It's the blueprint of a hidden priesthood, a sanctified rot that once flowed just beneath the surface of America's most radical frontier religion. You were never meant to hear this story, but now you will, not because it's safe, but because once you know it, you can't go back. So ask yourself this now, before we continue: what would you be willing to sacrifice if you believed it would save your soul? And better yet, what if the man telling you it was God's will was your own husband? You're about to descend into a forgotten vein of American history, one that was buried not just by snow and time, but by deliberate silence, a silence paid for in blood. You're still here. Don't blink. This is just the beginning, and there are 32 more layers to uncover, one for each degree deeper into the darkness. You've crossed the threshold. Now you will see. Ezekiel Whitmore was no common man. The church didn't accept common men. Not in 1847, not in the wilderness, not in the building of Zion. He arrived in the second wave, after the leaders had carved the path, but before the systems had calcified. He was part of that volatile middle, men who were devout enough to follow without question, but isolated enough to craft their own interpretation of what God truly demanded. And Ezekiel interpreted. He brought with him 4 wives, not uncommon in principle, but his situation was unique. Each woman served a different purpose, one to manage the home, one to bear the children, one to heal the sick, and one, Ruth, the youngest, to fulfill something else entirely. She had no blood ties left in the world. Her identity was what the church gave her. Her purpose, what Ezekiel told her it was. The moment she entered that cabin, her future had already been authored. That winter, the valley sealed them in. No roads, no visitors, just wind, silence, scripture, and Ezekiel's revelations, the kind that didn't come from the pulpit, the kind that came in whispers, in dreams, in symbols carved into floorboards and etched into firewood. Church records describe the family as unusually harmonious. That was the word, harmonious. But harmony, in the hands of a controlling man, becomes something else. It becomes unison, obedience, disappearance of self. Witnesses spoke of the women finishing each other's sentences, moving as though choreographed, smiling in eerie synchrony. A unity not born of joy, but of indoctrination. They bore identical scars on their wrists. Kitchen accidents, Ezekiel claimed, but they were too clean, too symmetrical, the kind of marks that came from ceremony, not clumsiness. The snows began in November, and by December the family cabin might as well have existed on the moon. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles north, a Amish convert who later admitted he'd avoided the Whitmore place altogether, said he heard singing late at night, not hymns, not prayers, but something slower, repetitive, as if reciting a phrase again and again until it became something else, something binding. That month, 2 hunters passed by and gifted the family a deer. They saw Sarah and Rebecca at the door, calm, composed, grateful. It was the last time anyone outside the cabin saw the Whitmore women alive. When the thaw came in March, the neighbors expected a return to normalcy. Cattle trading resumed, children ventured out to gather roots and berries, the church resumed its gatherings. But the Whitmore cabin remained silent. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The door stayed bolted, and Ezekiel, once seen weekly in the town square with his wives, appeared alone. He claimed sickness, said the women had taken ill during the worst of the cold and were resting, not to be disturbed. He even brought offerings to the chapel, candles, herbs, and a tattered red hymn book, claiming it belonged to Ruth, but the hymns were written in Latin. Ruth, like the others, spoke only English. Whispers began, quietly at first. Suspicion doesn't roar, it seeps. The bishop sent 2 men to check on the women. Ezekiel met them halfway down the trail with a rifle across his chest. He was cordial, smiling, but his eyes were different, sunken, raw. He blamed the darkness of winter, said the women were not to be seen. "The Lord is working within them," he said. "This is a sacred time of silence." The men returned unsettled. The bishop, not wanting conflict, let it lie. In 1847, church discipline was more cautious, especially in remote outposts. Leaders believed in divine privacy, and Ezekiel, after all, had always tithed generously, always quoted scripture. It wasn't until a child, barefoot and shivering, wandered down from the hills that things changed. Her name was Lydia. She was 8. She said she had seen a girl in white standing in the river. Said the girl didn't move, didn't speak, just stood waist-deep in the icy water, hands clasped in prayer, hair floating like a crown. The river was searched. Nothing was found, but the fear took root. By April, Ezekiel stopped coming into town altogether. Letters were sent, no reply. A group of 3 men from the militia rode out and found the cabin, padlocked from the inside. They called to him. No answer. Eventually, they forced the door open. Inside, they found only Ezekiel, thin, pale, kneeling before a wooden altar covered in cloth and dried flowers. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His voice was hoarse. He said only one thing: "They're not gone. They're transformed." That night, he was arrested and taken into custody. No bodies, no blood, just the altar, and 4 identical white dresses folded neatly without dust. The arrest of Ezekiel Whitmore sent shockwaves through the settlement. Not because of violence, there was none. Not because of confession, he offered none. It was the silence that unnerved them. A man of words, reduced to whispers. A preacher of conviction, now unreadable. When questioned, he repeated one phrase again and again: "The covenant is sealed. They've ascended." The sheriff found his journal, bound in calfskin and wrapped in twine beneath a floorboard in the cabin. It was not a diary. It was scripture. Not copied, but invented. A fevered blend of Old Testament verse, apocalyptic prophecy, and his own visions. He called it the doctrine of folding. And within its pages, he described rituals not taught by any church. Prayers recited backward, names buried in river mud, marriages consummated with blood drawn from palms instead of kisses. He wrote of the 4th path, a state of holiness reached only through flesh without anchor. The soul, he believed, must be severed from its mortal vessel while in full awareness. He called it a gift, a purification, and he wrote of the 4 women as pillars of the new Eden. The church distanced itself immediately. A public statement was issued. Ezekiel Whitmore acted alone. His theology was non-canonical, his behavior incompatible with the teachings of the prophet. But privately, a delegation of elders was sent to examine the journal, not to condemn it, no, to understand where he had learned these things, because some of the phrases within it mirrored apocryphal fragments known only to the highest initiates. Ezekiel was not insane in the clinical sense. He was methodical, precise, controlled, and that terrified the men charged with evaluating him. He ate only once per day, prayed at dawn and dusk, slept on the floor, refusing the cot. He claimed the prison cell was temporary, that judgment would come not from men, but from the return of the folded. What troubled investigators most was this: there were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, no evidence that the women had ever tried to flee. It was as if they had participated willingly, as if they believed. In one interview, when asked why the women disappeared, he smiled and said, "They knew the weight of the world, so we let it go." And then, after a long pause, he added, "You'll see them again, but not with your eyes." The town didn't know what to do with Ezekiel Whitmore. There were no laws for this, no precedent. He had not confessed to murder. There were no remains, no proof of violence, just silence, speculation, and those 4 white dresses. The sheriff, Reverend Holm, and 3 elders debated for weeks. Some argued for banishment, others wanted a trial, but the community feared exposure. News of this would stain the settlement's purity. The solution came quietly. Indefinite confinement in the church basement. No public proceedings, no graves to dig. Just a man, and the secret he refused to release. They placed him beneath the chapel where he once preached. A stone cellar with no windows, just oil lamps and a rusted bed frame. He was given scriptures and silence. But he didn't read. He wrote. Dozens of pages, doctrines, diagrams, genealogies twisted into symbols. At night, guards reported a low humming, like chanting without words. One claimed to see shadow figures on the wall that didn't match Ezekiel's shape. Another refused to return altogether, insisting that the prisoner's eyes glowed when he prayed. Meanwhile, townspeople began to speak in hushed voices, not about what had happened, but about what hadn't. The crops that failed, the cattle that wandered into rivers and drowned, 3 children who vanished into the forest near the Whitmore cabin, and the singing, always the singing, from the trees, from the fields, a soft female harmony, the kind that didn't carry on the wind, the kind that settled in the bones. Reverend Holm visited Ezekiel one last time. He brought water, a copy of the Book of Mormon, and a question. What happened to them? Ezekiel didn't speak at first. He simply stared. Then he leaned forward and with utter calm said, "They unlatched the world." When pressed, he offered this explanation. "There's a place just beneath this one. Not hell, not heaven, just beneath." They walked sideways into it, like slipping between walls. You'd be amazed how thin they are. The walls, I mean. Holm left shaken. He burned Ezekiel's writings the next morning. But it was too late. The soil behind the church began to crack that spring, and beneath the earth, something moved, not violently, slowly, as if remembering. That year, no wildflowers bloomed in the valley, just silence and echoes. They sealed the church basement, not out of justice but fear. A new floor was laid and no record of the cellar was kept in any official blueprint. It became a forbidden place. Not by decree, but by unspoken consensus. Children were warned away from the chapel. Elders tightened their sermons. They preached repentance, simplicity, fear of prideful revelation. But the people remembered Ezekiel, what he'd said, how he'd looked. He hadn't begged, he hadn't wept. He had waited, as if expecting something. And then, as if on cue, things began to return. The youngest of the town's midwives began having dreams, vivid, repeating. In them, she walked barefoot through a snow-covered field, always the same direction, always to the same sound, a distant, rhythmic tapping. She began sketching what she saw, strange latticework patterns, spirals with no center, and always 4 figures standing in a circle, their faces veiled. When asked what they were doing, she whispered, "They're still choosing." Choosing what? She never answered. One night she left her home, walked into the woods, and was never seen again. Her shoes were found neatly placed at the forest's edge. Inside them, a folded page from Ezekiel's burned journal. How it survived, no one knew. More followed. Livestock were found arranged in patterns, not mutilated, just placed as if choreographed, always in groups of 4, always with eyes open, staring toward the east. A farmer found his well filled not with water, but ash. The church bells rang at midnight, though no one had pulled the rope, and inside one of the cabins vacated after the disappearances, someone found long strands of hair nailed to the ceiling beams, braided, ceremonial, still warm. People began to leave, quietly, entire families packing wagons before dawn and vanishing into the frontier. They left their homes unlocked, candles still burning, meals half-eaten, no letters, no explanations. The ones who stayed stopped speaking of the past. The Whitmores became a shadow, a surname only whispered in warning. Children were told they were missionaries who died in the cold. The truth was too heavy, too incomplete. The church, in time, redrew district lines and changed the name of the valley. But names don't erase history, they only misdirect it, because beneath the ground the old name still echoed, and in dreams it still answered. By 1863, the settlement was renamed Providence Bend, a hopeful title carefully chosen by church officials to overwrite the whispers still carried on the wind. But the land remembered. The soil held memory like marrow, and beneath the foundation of the old chapel, now converted into a storehouse, strange sounds continued, knocking, soft thuds like footsteps, but never when anyone was watching, only when they were alone, only when they were afraid. A new family, the Claibornes, arrived that summer. Outsiders, unaware of the town's buried history. They were devout, optimistic, eager to build. They purchased the Whitmore property for next to nothing. Locals watched from behind curtains as the Claibornes moved in. Husband, wife, and 3 daughters. That was the last time the girls were seen in town together. Within weeks, one daughter refused to speak. She sat for hours facing the attic wall, humming a melody no one recognized. The second began waking in the night, screaming about the women behind the mirror. The third, youngest, was found in the barn, carving circles into the beams with a sewing needle. She claimed she was measuring the distance between here and the other side. Their mother wrote to the bishop 3 times. No reply came. When she rode out herself to deliver a 4th letter, her horse returned without her, bridle torn, eyes wild. The father remained for a time, insisting nothing was wrong, but neighbors noticed he stopped attending church. His hair turned white in a single month. When questioned, he would say only, "They pray at the corners. If you stand still long enough, you'll hear them answer." One night, thunder rolled over the valley, but no storm followed, just a dry wind and a smell like burnt sugar. The Claiborne house stood dark, no lamps, no voices. A neighbor approached the next morning to check in. The entire family was gone. Their shoes were lined up outside the front door, clean, orderly, untouched by dust. Inside, every mirror had been turned to face the walls, and above the fireplace, carved into the stone, was a phrase not seen since Ezekiel's last sermon: 4 to open, 1 to guide, silence is the key. The church quietly reclaimed the property, but the damage was done. The Whitmore name had returned, and with it, the first signs of something ancient waking. It wasn't just the valley anymore. In the years that followed, strange letters began arriving at the regional church headquarters in Salt Lake City. They weren't signed. Each bore only a location, Providence Bend, and a line of scripture that had been altered slightly. Instead of divine comfort, the words took on an unfamiliar tone, punitive, ritualistic, surgical. One read, "Ye shall not suffer the witches to live unless they speak in unison." Another, "He that hath 4 wives and heareth no voices is deaf to the Spirit." These weren't random scribblings, they were carefully selected, coded almost, and they came once a month, always on the same day, the 27th. Church officials sent missionaries to investigate. Young, faithful men, clean-cut and obedient. The first pair reported a strange sensation upon entering the valley, pressure behind the eyes, an unshakable sense of being watched. They lasted 3 days. The next team stayed a week. On their final night, they found 4 identical shawls hanging from the branches outside their rented cabin. Red, hand-woven, stitched with the symbol of the old church. No one admitted placing them. No one claimed to have seen anything. But in the local chapel's records, someone had signed the guest book. The name written in precise handwriting was E. Whitmore. It was dismissed as a cruel prank. Locals were interviewed. No one confessed. No leads. And then a bishop, an older man with ties to the original settlement, quietly requested that Providence Bend be removed from all updated maps. The request was denied. But a few weeks later, the town's census numbers mysteriously dropped. 36 families vanished from the records. Tax rolls were blank. No mail routes were listed. The place had become a ghost, deliberately. But not dead. A missionary journal, later smuggled out of a private archive, told of a night when the wind stopped entirely. When the trees froze mid-sway. When the cows lay down facing the same direction, and when, from the base of the old Whitmore land, came a low humming, 4 tones, layered and droning like a hymn sung in reverse. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The 4 stand again, and the 5th is almost ready. Whatever had begun in 1847 had never ended. It had simply been waiting for the right generation, the right listener, and most importantly, the right sacrifice. In 1871, a boy named Elias Harrow wandered into Providence Bend, barefoot, silent, and covered in soot. He was no older than 12. No one recognized him. No family came forward. When asked where he came from, he only whispered, "The house with no doors." The sheriff brought him in, offered food and warmth, but Elias refused to sit near any fire. He sat in the corner, facing the wall, murmuring names, 4 of them, again and again. Mary, Ruth, Eliza, Sarah, the names of Ezekiel Whitmore's wives. He had no scars, no wounds, no signs of physical abuse, but his eyes, widened and unfocused, told a different story. The doctor noted signs of extreme sleep deprivation, but the boy claimed he never slept. "They won't let me," he said, "not while the hymn is unfinished." When asked to explain, Elias drew a strange diagram in charcoal on the floor, 4 circles in a cross formation, and in the center, a 5th, smaller circle, filled completely in black. Beneath it he wrote, "The 5th is the mouth." Within a week, he vanished. His bed untouched, his clothes neatly folded, no signs of forced entry, but on the inside of his bedroom window, a handprint in ash, small, child-sized, and above it, written backwards into the fog of his last breath, "He is almost here." The church denied ever hearing of the boy. Locals spoke less and less of the Whitmore house. Its windows remained dark, its soil overgrown, but once every few months, travelers along the eastern ridge reported hearing soft, layered singing in the valley, like women harmonizing without words. Always 4 voices, never 5. Some said Elias had been born in the basement of the old house, that he was never meant to leave, that he'd heard too much. Others believed he was the last descendant of Whitmore himself, a child hidden away until the time was right. Whatever the truth, the town changed after Elias. Doors were locked. Earlier, church attendance declined. Children were warned to stay off the old trails, especially after sundown. But still, the air carried something, a frequency below hearing, a feeling that the land itself had begun to breathe, and at its center, something pulsed beneath the earth, ancient, unfinished, and growing louder by the season. In the summer of 1874, an amateur geologist named Clarence Munn arrived in Providence Bend. He wasn't interested in folklore. He came with a grant from Brigham Young University to study the unusual mineral patterns reported in the valley. Strange magnetic disruptions had been charted, compasses spun, watches stopped, and horses refused to approach the eastern ridge without balking. Locals told Munn the land was sick, but he dismissed it as superstition. Munn set up camp near the edge of the old Whitmore property. On his third day, he recorded that the ground trembled just past midnight. No quake was registered anywhere else in the state. He dismissed it as soil settling, but then he noticed something else. A hum, a tone that vibrated at the edge of hearing, like metal under tension. He followed the sound to a cluster of stones arranged in a near-perfect circle, half buried under moss and thyme. At the center he found something unnatural. 4 wooden posts driven into the ground at exact cardinal points. They were scorched at the tips, as if once set ablaze but never consumed. That night, his journal entries changed. The handwriting grew erratic. The sentences disjointed, one line repeated over 6 pages. I heard her voice in my bones. By the 5th night, he had stopped writing altogether. A search party found his campsite untouched. Food still warm, tent unzipped. But there was no sign of Clarence. Only his boots, left neatly beside the stone circle, and a crude carving in the bark of a nearby tree, 4 X's and a filled-in black circle. A 5th mark. When the university reviewed his recovered journals, they chose not to publish. A professor quietly resigned. Another moved out of state. The remaining materials were sealed under the pretense of spiritual conflict with institutional doctrine. Back in Providence Bend, the circle was fenced off, unofficially. The one claimed responsibility. But the area was marked on local maps simply as the still ground. No birds flew overhead, no insects crawled near it. Children whispered that if you stood in the center at twilight, you'd feel a heartbeat under your feet, not yours, not the Earth's. Something deeper, something waiting for acknowledgement. The Whitmore wives, it seemed, had never truly left. They were simply patient. In 1876, the Church of Latter-day Saints dispatched a young missionary named Elias Redd to Providence Bend. His assignment was quiet outreach, rebuild trust, re-establish the church's moral presence, and observe. Privately, however, his orders were more severe. Assess whether the lingering rumors of the Whitmore household had merit, and if so, ensure the records never reached Salt Lake. Redd was diligent, idealistic, and utterly unprepared. He moved into a rented room above the general store, kept meticulous records, and began interviewing the oldest residents, those who remembered Ezekiel Whitmore's time firsthand. What he found disturbed him. Every interview ended with the same phrase, spoken unconsciously by each elder. They sang him into silence. Redd wrote in his journal that the phrase haunted him. He began researching regional hymnals, hoping for clues in melody or lyrics, but the deeper he went, the more patterns emerged that didn't belong to music, they belonged to ritual. A sequence of tones, a pattern of breath, a vibration beneath language. One night, he attended a funeral for a child lost in a well. As the mourners sang, Redd noted a shift in pitch. 4 women, older, seated in the back pew, began harmonizing softly, not to the melody, not to any known hymn. Their voices dipped into a minor key that chilled the air. He later asked who they were. The pastor went pale. "We don't talk to them," he whispered. "They're descendants of Whitmore's line. We let them sing." Redd returned to his room and locked the door. That night he reported hearing singing beneath his floorboards. No instruments, just breath and voice, layered, distant and relentless. He stuffed wax in his ears. Still, the sound bled through. By morning, his hair had begun to fall out in patches. In his final entry, he wrote, "I saw them in my dream. 4 women, facing outward, behind two balban. Something in shadow, swaying. It had no face, only a mouth, stitched shut with strands of hair." The journal was mailed to Salt Lake but never officially received. The general store owner claimed a man in church attire took it before sunrise. The mail route records were altered that week. Red was never heard from again, and once more the town forgot him like they were trained to. By 1880, Providence Bend had become a place of quiet omissions. The census lists were full of gaps. Births were rarely recorded, deaths even less so, and those who left the town, whether by train, foot, or coffin, were never spoken of again. It was as though the town itself edited memory. But something changed that year when an outsider arrived claiming blood right. Her name was Lydia Dane. She was not born in Providence Bend. She came from Chicago, educated, sharp, and dressed in widow's black, though she had never been married. She said she was the great-granddaughter of Ezekiel Whitmore's first wife, Abigail, the one who had gone mad and thrown herself into the Ogden River. Town records said Abigail had no children. Lydia disagreed. She carried with her a bundle of letters written in a woman's hand, Abigail's journal fragments, ink faded, paper crumbling at the edges. They described the early days of the Whitmore household, but also something more insidious, a ritual binding. Abigail had suspected the other wives of forming a secret pact, not to trap Ezekiel, but to silence him. Not out of love, but fear. Lydia read aloud at the town hall, uninvited. She quoted from Abigail's writings, "He was not a man, not holy. What came to us in the dark was not what we married. It was a vessel filled with something older. We had to bind it with song." The townsfolk grew restless. The mayor asked her to leave. She refused. That night, Lydia broke into the Whitmore property, or what was left of it. The homestead had long since collapsed, but the cellar remained. She descended with a lantern and a tape recorder. Only one was recovered. The lantern was found extinguished near the circle of stones. The tape recorder, still running. What it captured has since been reviewed only a handful of times, and always behind locked doors. At first, only static. Then, breath. Then, a woman's voice. Calm, deliberate. "You shouldn't have come back." Then 4 voices, harmonizing in a discordant rising chant, not words, not song, just sound, pulling upward like a scream swallowed backward through time. Lydia was never found. But 2 weeks later, a new stone appeared at the center of the circle. Blank, weathered, freshly placed. The townspeople said nothing. But from that night on, no one dared sing in Providence Bend. In 1883, an archivist named Jeremiah Pike traveled to Providence Bend under the pretense of historical preservation, but Pike wasn't sent by any historical society. He worked for a private order, an obscure sect operating within the church, tasked with documenting phenomena that defied scripture yet couldn't be ignored. These men were not priests, they were cleaners. Pike's mission was simple: recover any remaining documents tied to Ezekiel Whitmore, assess the scope of local heresies, and determine if Providence Bend posed a risk to wider ecclesiastical control. But what Pike found was not heresy, it was containment. Locals were cautious with him, children would not look him in the eyes, women muttered prayers as he passed, and men warned him not to stay past dusk. They didn't elaborate. They didn't need to. Something in their posture, the tightness around their mouths, the way their eyes shifted east when the sun dipped, spoke of a rule that could not be written. Still, Pike persisted. He interviewed the oldest living resident, Miss Hester Langley, bedridden and nearly blind. When he asked about Whitmore, her fingers clenched the bedsheets. "Don't ask about him, ask about the basement." Pike did. She began to cry, not out of fear, but exhaustion. Then she whispered, they thought binding it in flesh would be enough, but the wives didn't agree on the terms. One loved him, one feared him, one obeyed, one hated. 4 intentions, 4 voices, a ritual fractured by emotion. Pike noted everything. That night he visited the Whitmore cellar, now covered in ivy and used as a dumping site for rotted timber. Beneath the boards, he uncovered an old door carved with musical notation, 4 bars, 4 keys, 4 harmonies. He entered. Inside was only a single stone chair at the center of a dirt floor. Around it, burned candles long extinguished, and on the wall, etched in soot, "Do not listen, do not hum, do not echo." He turned to leave, but behind him a soft sound rose, not singing, breathing, layered, feminine, surrounding. Pike screamed. The sound cut short as if choked mid-air. When locals found the cellar open, there was no body, only his notebook left neatly on the chair, closed. The final page read, "They don't need him anymore. They learned how to sing without a source." By 1885, Providence Bend had become a town carved in silence. No bells rang, no choirs sang. Even the schoolteacher was instructed to hum lessons silently to the younger children, relying on gestures and written word. Something had shifted after Jeremiah Pike vanished, something unspoken yet deeply understood by every soul who remained. A man named Reverend Simon Greeley arrived that year, sent not by the church, but self-appointed. Greeley believed Providence Bend was suffering from collective delusion, a result of spiritual rot, not supernatural cause. He had heard rumors of chants, of disappearances, of unmarked graves, and he sought to dispel them with doctrine. He held a sermon on his third day. Only 4 people came. He spoke loudly, defiantly, quoting from Psalms and Revelation. His voice echoed down the empty chapel walls, rebounding unnaturally, as though the architecture itself disapproved of speech. He sang hymns, alone, daring the silence to respond. That night he recorded in his journal, "They are not cursed, they are conditioned, fear passed down through repetition. I will unchain them." He began knocking on doors by night, offering scripture. Most turned him away. One woman, Martha Clem, let him in, an act she would not survive. What happened in her home that night remains a subject of local horror, but fragments were found. Her Bible soaked in candle wax, her floorboards ripped upward from beneath. Her mouth, when the constable found her, had been sewn shut with horsehair. She was still alive. Barely. Greeley was gone. But his journal remained, open beside her chair. The final entry was brief, scrawled in haste. "It's not the silence that keeps them safe. It's the melody. And I sang the wrong one." The town held a vote the following morning. They boarded up the chapel, tore down the bell tower, burned all hymnals. From that day forward, Providence Bend became the only settlement in Utah Territory where whistling was punishable by exile. Even birds avoided the town's sky. And still, the cellar beneath the Whitmore house remained untouched. Children dared each other to run past it. No one lingered. Locals swore they could hear the faintest hum when standing too close, never distinct, never clear, but always in 4 parts. The town had stopped singing, but something beneath had not. In the spring of 1887, the U.S. Marshal Service dispatched an investigator named Eli Camden to Providence Bend. Officially, the visit was part of a broader inquiry into disappearing census records and reports of unregistered births. Unofficially, Camden had been pulled into the orbit of a much older concern, what the Bureau now called anomalous cultural zones. Providence Bend was flagged not for crime, but for compliance, a kind of enforced silence that spanned generations. Camden arrived alone. He was practical, skeptical, and hardened by war. He kept a Smith Wesson on his hip and a silver crucifix around his neck, an inheritance from his grandmother, who had once whispered to him as a boy, "Some places make the land forget God." He thought it was metaphor. By the time he stepped off the coach in Providence Bend, the town already felt wrong. It wasn't the lack of sound that unnerved him, it was the shape of the quiet. A silence so total, so reverent, it felt like something listening. Camden began asking questions, polite at first, then firm. He found no school records, no marriage licenses, no death certificates. When he pressed the town clerk, a brittle man named Otis Brewer, the answer came in the form of a single phrase, scribbled on a slip of paper. "Records, sing." Camden dismissed it. Superstition. Local nonsense. He decided to visit the cellar under the Whitmore house. Locals warned him. A child tugged his coat and said, "Don't let your thoughts hum." He ignored them all. The cellar door had changed. It now bore 4 vertical slashes, uneven, raw, as if clawed by something trying to etch its name in wood. Inside, the stone chair remained. Around it, the old candles had melted into misshapen spires, resembling faces, each one caught mid-scream. Camden felt dizzy. He reached for his notebook, and then the breathing returned. But it was different now. Not feminine, not human. It was vast, layered, disembodied, and mimicking. It echoed his own breath with a half-second delay, then his heartbeat, then the sound of his voice whispering his own name. Camden staggered out, fell to his knees in the yard, and vomited. He left town before sunrise, riding west without collecting his badge or pay. When he returned to Washington, he filed a single line in his report. "Providence Bend is not a town, it is a throat." In the winter of 1888, something resurfaced. The local doctor, a recluse named Dr. Aldous Vreen, had lived in Providence Bend since 1869. He was not born there. He did not marry. He was the only man in the county with formal medical training, yet his services were rarely requested. The town preferred to handle things quietly. But on December 12th, he summoned the elders, not with a letter, not with a bell, but with smoke. Thick, black smoke bled from the chimney of his long-abandoned barn, the one behind his home that hadn't been entered in over a decade. Townsfolk gathered outside, staring silently. No one approached. They waited for a sign. At dusk, Vreen emerged, wearing a mask stitched from deer hide. His hands were gloved. In his arms he carried a wrapped bundle, about the size of a newborn. He said nothing. He placed it at the steps of the meeting hall, turned, and walked back into the smoke. The bundle trembled. Elder Ruth Neely stepped forward. She had survived the Whitmore years, had heard the 4-part hum in her childhood, and once nearly slit her own tongue just to keep from singing in her sleep. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a child, pale, hairless, genderless, breathing, but wrong. Its chest didn't rise and fall. It pulsed like something aquatic, no eyes, no mouth, but ears, oversized, veined, and twitching. Around its neck, a chain with 4 bells. No clapper inside, just hollow. Vreen left no note, no explanation. The elders debated for 3 nights. Burn it, bury it, return it to the cellar. Each choice felt like speaking an oath none were willing to utter aloud. On the 4th morning, the child, if it was a child, was gone. No footprints, no tracks, just the bells, placed neatly in a circle. After that, dreams changed. Several residents began reporting identical nightmares of a faceless woman rocking something under the floorboards, whispering not to a baby, but to a tune. 4 notes, always the same, 1 low, 2 rising, 1 falling. They awoke with dried blood on their ears and an overwhelming compulsion to never repeat the melody, even in thought. Providence Bend understood. The cellar hadn't created the silence. It had simply tuned them. By the turn of the century, Providence Bend was no longer listed on official maps. Its roads were redrawn, its census entries vanished, trains were rerouted 2 miles east without explanation. Cartographers reported a recurring error. Any map that included the town would print with a faint smudge over its location, a grey blot like a thumbprint pressed too hard into the ink. Some claimed the land refused to be remembered. But the town remained. In 1901, Reverend Samuel Keir arrived from Chicago. Sent by the Reformed Ecclesiastical Society, he believed he was entering a spiritually neglected zone. He was 32, Ivy League educated, and fiercely logical. His sermons had drawn crowds in Illinois, where he railed against spiritualism, mysticism, and the encroaching madness of rural folk religion. He called himself a lighthouse in a swamp. Providence Bend welcomed him, too eagerly. They helped him build a small chapel on the edge of town. Children brought flowers, elderly women fed him meals, but they never spoke of Mr. Whitmore, never mentioned the cellar, and never entered the church after dusk. At first, Keir considered it cultural politeness, a town still unlearning superstition. Then came the choir. He never started one, never auditioned singers. But during his evening sermons, from the back of the church he began to hear them, 4 distinct voices singing so softly they seemed woven into the wind itself. One high, one gravelly, one hollow, and one deep. No lyrics, just tone. He searched the pews, found nothing. He stopped preaching at night, but the song followed him. One morning, he awoke to find a phrase carved into the wood above his bed. In harmony, the veil thins. He reported the incident to the county sheriff. The sheriff never arrived. A week later, his Bible disappeared. In its place, a handwritten journal, its pages filled with musical notation, inked by a trembling hand and signed only with a symbol, 4 vertical lines joined by a single horizontal slash. Keir read one measure aloud. His teeth ached for 3 days. He left town without ceremony, abandoning the chapel and its congregation. In his resignation letter, mailed from a train station 3 counties away, he wrote only this: "They do not worship God, they worship resonance." And beneath it, one final sentence scrawled in the margin, half erased: "The cellar is not a room, it's an instrument." By 1909, the chapel stood abandoned. Locals avoided it, even in daylight. Ivy crept through the shattered windows, dust choked the altar. But what disturbed people most wasn't the decay, it was the smell. Sweet, metallic, almost floral, like burnt honeysuckle and old blood. A scent that never faded, not with wind, not with rain, not even with fire. Children dared each other to go inside. None did it twice. One boy, Elijah Pruitt, managed to last nearly 7 minutes. He returned with a nosebleed and a vacant stare. When asked what he saw, he said only, "The notes were walking." He never spoke again, not a word, just hummed, quietly, rhythmically, 4 tones, over and over, for the rest of his life. He was institutionalized by 13. Some claimed the chapel had become a mouth, no longer a place of worship, but a cavity, yawning open, hungry for voices. The floorboards warped downward in the center, forming a kind of bowl. Anything dropped inside vanished, even sunlight. And then, without warning, the floor began to emit sound. Not always, not predictably. But on certain days, usually after a birth, a death, or a storm, visitors claimed to hear it. Deep vibrations, like breath echoing through a wooden lung. Not from the walls, not from the air, from below. The town sent men to investigate. They pried up planks, dug beneath the chapel. No cellar, no void, just dirt and rock. Yet the sounds persisted, and then, one night, someone heard footsteps. Not above, beneath, slow, dragging, rhythmic. Like someone walking in circles just under the floor. The boards didn't move, the earth didn't quake, but the sound traveled through the walls into the ground, into the dreams of those nearby. A woman miscarried. A man clawed out his eardrums with a spoon. A horse dropped dead, its body vibrating long after its heart had stopped. The town sealed the chapel with iron, ales and a ring of salt. But salt doesn't bind what was never living, and the chapel didn't resist. It waited. Because the sound, whatever it was, had learned something over the years. It had listened to prayers, screams, and silence. It had learned the shape of belief. And now, it wanted more than voices. It wanted harmony. In the spring of 1911, a musicologist named Dr. Franklin Rowe arrived in Providence Bend. He had been hired by a university in St. Louis to study rural hymn traditions and had heard rumors about the eerie harmonics surrounding the abandoned chapel. A skeptic by nature, Rowe dismissed ghost stories as folk delusion, but the reports fascinated him. He saw in them not madness, but pattern, recurrence, structure, and that to him meant something deeper was hiding under the myth. He came with tuning forks, a phonograph, and a custom-built oscilloscope. And within hours of entering the chapel, Rowe knew something was wrong. Not supernaturally wrong, mathematically wrong. The space was acoustically impossible. He clapped. The echo returned not from the walls but from below, delayed by 1.6 seconds, longer than any known underground chamber could allow. The tones that vibrated through the wood were not random. They were always four, always in the same sequence, and every sequence was tuned to a precise frequency: 432 Hz, 528 Hz, 7441 Hz, and 963 Hz. Ancient solfeggio tones, frequencies associated not with music, but with healing, transformation, awakening. Rowe was intrigued, then alarmed, because the tones didn't just play, they interacted. When he played back his recordings, the chapel would respond. The floor would thrum in synchrony, the windows would vibrate as if joining the chord. It was as though the building itself was listening. So he tested a hypothesis. He played a dissonant frequency, one that clashed with the established four. The chapel shook. Dust fell from the rafters, the air turned metallic, and from beneath the floor came a sound Rowe would later describe in his notes as a scream built from harmony. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was as if the wood, the stone, the memory of the room itself had cried out in protest. He fled. Rowe never published his findings. But he did leave behind a field journal. In its final entry, dated April 3rd, 1911, he wrote, "These are not songs, they are permissions." And below that, the Whitmore family did not vanish. They became the song. In the decades that followed, no one else dared enter the chapel. It stood like a wound on the land, sealed but festering, waiting for someone else to listen, or worse, to sing back. In 1915, the land surrounding the Whitmore Chapel was quietly purchased by a man named Ezra Dalton. He claimed to be a cattleman from Wyoming, though no one could verify it. He arrived alone with no family, no livestock, and no intention of integrating with the townsfolk. He built a modest home half a mile from the chapel, fenced off the surrounding acreage, and posted signs every 100 feet. Trespassers will be reclaimed. Not shot, not prosecuted, reclaimed. Locals took the hint. Ezra never visited the general store. He didn't attend church. He didn't write letters or receive any, but every Sunday night at dusk a low hum would echo across the valley, coming from the chapel, deep, vibrating, steady, as if something underground were turning, not loud enough to hurt, just enough to remind. At first, people assumed Ezra was living in the chapel, but then strange lights were seen on his property, concentric rings of flickering lanterns arranged in perfect geometric patterns. No one could explain how they were lit, or why they rotated, because they did. The lights moved. Witnesses said the circles would spin slowly, counterclockwise, then stop, as if waiting for instruction. One boy watched from a distant hill and claimed he saw Ezra standing in the center, arms raised, motionless, while the lights swirled around him. It lasted until dawn. By morning, birds in the region would go silent for days. The town grew afraid. Some whispered that Ezra was a priest, not of any Christian rite, but of the old chapel itself, a caretaker, or worse, an interpreter. Because every month, like clockwork, he would enter the chapel alone and remain inside for exactly 4 hours. At the end of each visit, the air would be thick with static, and those nearby would report hearing a low chant, not in Latin, not in English, but in tones. Just 4, always the same, as though some had nay or something beneath the floor was answering, or practicing. Then one day, Ezra was gone. No trace, no note, no struggle, just an empty house and 4 fresh notches carved into the chapel door, deep, measured, tuned. The property was never resold, and the chapel remained unopened. But those who walk past still swear they hear it, faint, rhythmic, pulsing through the wood, as if the land itself remembers the song and is still rehearsing. In 1923, a team of federal surveyors arrived in Providence Bend under the guise of mapping fault lines for a proposed rail line. But the route made no sense. There were no mineral veins, no trade hubs, no need for a station in the area, and yet the team, 6 men in uniform, erected an electrified perimeter around the Whitmore chapel within 2 days of arrival. They didn't speak to locals. They didn't stay in town. They camped beside the chapel in a row of government-issue tents, ran wires from the structure into a series of humming machines, and spent long nights inside the building with strange instruments, machines with curved horns and oscilloscopes that glowed green in the dark. A rancher named Henry Cale, whose land bordered the eastern boundary, claimed he saw 2 of the men dragging something heavy out of the chapel. It was wrapped in cloth, but its shape was unmistakable. A coffin, unusually long and narrow. Instead of loading it into their truck, they buried it. Right there, no prayers, no marker, just 6 shovels and silence. Cale went to report the incident to the sheriff, but by morning the entire camp was gone. No trucks, no wires, no gravesite. Only a single object remained, a rusted metal rod driven deep into the earth beside the chapel's front step. It emitted a high-pitched frequency, not audible to the human ear, but enough to drive dogs wild and crack windows within a 50-foot radius. It pulsed every 27 seconds. Rhythmic, deliberate, measured. When local law enforcement contacted the Department of the Interior, they were told no such team had been dispatched, no permits had been filed, no seismic activity had been recorded in the area. Officially, the chapel did not exist. Unofficially, something was being monitored. A retired telegraph operator from Kansas City, who happened to be visiting family in the area, claimed he recognized the pew. Those intervals, he said it wasn't random. It was Morse code. He translated the repeated phrase over several hours. It consisted of only 3 words. We remember still. What exactly was being remembered? And who was doing the remembering? That question was never answered. Because that same week, every record of the Whitmore family in Utah Territory archives, birth, marriage, land deeds, was mysteriously lost in a fire that started with no fuel and burned with no flame. The chapel remained untouched for the next 14 years. Nature tried to reclaim it, ivy crawling up the stone, roots pushing through the foundation, but something always held the structure together. Storms would batter the valley, but the chapel's roof remained intact. Snow would fall in thick sheets, but never linger on its steps. Local boys who dared each other to approach it in the dead of night often came back, changed. One returned mute. Another, Levi Rourke, spoke of hearing voices, but not in his ears. In my teeth, he whispered, trembling. They sang through my teeth. He died 6 days later, jaw locked, eyes bloodshot, no signs of violence, just a rigid corpse, arms crossed over his chest, and a smile wide enough to split the corners of his mouth. His mother found a note tucked into his boot. 4 words, scrawled in charcoal. They still want more. In 1937, a traveling professor of religious anthropology named Charles Etheridge arrived in Providence Bend. He claimed to be researching pre-denominational frontier theocracies, a vague term that didn't sit right with the townsfolk. But Etheridge was persistent. He camped near the chapel, kept a thick leather journal, and refused to speak about his nightly observations. He lasted 11 days. On the 12th, his tent was found shredded, his journal torn into precise vertical strips, each page reduced to uniform ribbons. The pages were later reconstructed and archived by a professor at Brigham Young University, but the contents only deepened the mystery. Etheridge had recorded symbols, not letters, not runes, but shapes made of sound. He claimed the chapel emitted frequencies that drew patterns in the dirt, that iron filings left on the floor would arrange themselves into spirals when the tones began. He described auditory glyphs, sigils constructed from resonance, a language not meant for lungs or lips but Bon-S. The final page was a drawing, not of a creature or a person, but of a door, round, ancient, sealed not by a lock, but by silence. Etheridge believed the chapel was never meant to be opened by hands. It was waiting for someone who could listen the right way, or perhaps remember. What happened next silenced all curiosity, because that same week lightning struck the chapel. Locals saw the flash, heard the impact, but the structure remained untouched. Only the ground beneath it was scorched, in the shape of a circle. Perfect. Endless. By 1942, Providence Bend had become a town of whispered warnings and sealed lips. The population had dwindled to just under 70 residents, most of them elderly, most unwilling to speak of the chapel at the edge of the valley. Children were forbidden from playing near it. Maps erased it. Surveyors ignored it. The land itself had begun to feel cursed. Then came the war. Draft notices pulled the last of the town's young men into the meat grinder of Europe. One of them, Elias Towner, was assigned to an army communications unit in France. There, in a damp trench outside Metz, Elias began reporting strange interference in his field equipment. Not static, voices, not in German, not in French, but in a dialect he had only heard once before, when he was 9 years old, standing outside the Whitmore chapel, listening to something vibrate deep within the stones. He described the transmissions to his superior, rhythmic pulses, followed by faint whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside his own skull. The commanding officer dismissed it as stress or shell shock, but Elias knew better. One night, during a barrage, Elias recorded the signal on magnetic tape. He played it back for his unit. Most heard nothing. But one man, Private Joseph Harlan, collapsed on the spot, clutching his head. Blood streamed from his ears. Before losing consciousness, he muttered a phrase in perfect English: "She is not dead. She only changed her shape." The tape was confiscated by military intelligence. Elias was reassigned. He never made it home. In 1946, his mother received a single package. No letter, no return address. Inside, a pair of headphones, a tape reel, and a photograph of the Whitmore Chapel taken from above, from the air, though no one in town had ever seen a plane fly over that valley. On the back of the photograph were 3 words, burned in, not written: "She till waits." That same night, the chapel bells rang for the first time in decades. No one had touched them, no rope had been pulled, but they rang 12 times, low, metallic and wet, as if water filled the hollow of each chime. And just like that, 3 people in town died in their sleep, each with a faint smile, each with no cause of death. The town's silence deepened after that night. Funerals were held without song, windows were nailed shut, the remaining elders refused to gather. Some claimed the air had changed, thicker, as if the atmosphere itself was bearing witness. Those who had once scoffed at the legends of Mr. Whitmore and his wives now crossed the street to avoid even seeing the chapel's roofline. But one man did not hide. Pastor Molden, a recent arrival from Salt Lake City, believed the town's fear was rooted in superstition. He was young, full of sermons and confidence. He walked with a silver cross tucked in his coat and quoted scripture with the fervor of the newly ordained. When he heard the stories, he laughed. "God built no house that cannot be reclaimed," he declared during his Sunday sermon, "and no curse stands where Christ walks in light." He made plans that very night. Molden would cleanse the chapel. He fasted for 3 days, preparing his body and mind. Then at dawn on the 4th, he set out with a Bible, a vial of holy water, and a stubborn heart. The townspeople watched from behind curtains, no one daring to follow. He entered the chapel just after sunrise. He never came out. When a search party finally worked up the courage to approach at dusk, they found the doors wide open. Inside, nothing had been touched. The pews sat in perfect order. Dust floated through the air. A shaft of light from a broken window illuminated the altar. And there, on the altar, lay Pastor Malden's Bible, open, pristine, untouched by time, but with every page completely blank. Beside it sat his cross, twisted, melted as if caught in fire. But there was no fire. There was only the faint smell of roses. The pastor himself was never found. No blood, no clothing, no footprints leaving the chapel, just the echo of his voice. Not recorded, not spoken, but remembered by everyone who entered. He had said one thing, over and over, whispered across the stone and wood. She has 4 mouths. The meaning was never explained. No one else dared enter again. The chapel was boarded up not by law but by silent agreement. But sometimes, just after dusk, the townsfolk swore they could hear someone still preaching inside and weeping. Always weeping. By 1951, the state had finally taken notice, not because of the chapel, not because of the disappearances, but because of the land itself, acres of fertile Utah soil, completely untouched, unclaimed, and unprofitable. A team from the Department of Land Management was sent to evaluate it for possible development. They arrived with survey maps, cameras, and government optimism. They left without a word. Not one report was filed, not one photograph submitted. All 3 men disappeared from the official record. Their families were told they'd been reassigned, but in truth, they were never seen again, not in Utah, not anywhere. Except for one brief anomaly. 6 months later, a parcel arrived at the home of Marvin Pike, the senior surveyor. It contained only a single object, a soil sample jar. Inside, it looked like ordinary dirt. But under a microscope, the soil appeared alive, moving, threaded with what one lab tech described as organic filaments that pulse when exposed to prayer. That tech resigned the following week. No university would touch the sample afterward. It was quietly incinerated, but the damage was done because one copy of the original report survived, and it contained a single line under unusual observations. There is something beneath the surface. A shape, possibly a structure, emits low-frequency vibration at dusk. The locals will not dig. That line never made it to the final report because no final report was ever approved. The project was cancelled without explanation. The land was deemed unsuitable for public use. By 1953, rumors had spread among Utah's underground circles, historians, esoteric societies, even fringe religious orders. They called it the Whitmore vibration. Some said it was a remnant of an ancient altar buried deep below. Others believed it was alive, not metaphorically, but in the biological sense, a sentient entity, and a slumbering intelligence waiting for something to stir it. And the townspeople, they stopped calling it the Whitmore Chapel. They started calling it her mouth, because sometimes in the right silence you could hear it breathe. The boards over the windows had begun to crack, not from age, but from pressure, from inside. And one boy, Elijah Turner, claimed to have seen something move behind the chapel's glass just before sunrise, something tall, something that blinked but not with eyes. Elijah Turner was only 11 when he saw it. A quiet boy, prone to sketching strange shapes in the margins of his school books, he never lied, not even to avoid punishment. So when he told his mother what he saw in the chapel window at dawn, she didn't scold him, she didn't question him, she slapped him. Hard. She screamed that he was never to speak of it again, that it was dangerous to even think about. Elijah didn't cry, he simply nodded, went to his room and locked the door, and from that day on, he stopped speaking entirely. But he drew obsessively. On napkins, school desks, the backs of receipts, even the walls of his closet, the image was always the same, a tall, slender figure without a face, its arms outstretched, but its hands melted into long, weeping lines. Above it, a black sun. Below it, 4 open mouths, arranged like a cross, each with teeth too human to be imagined by a child. The school counselor thought it was trauma. His mother called it madness. But one man took the drawings seriously. Dr. Everett Bloom, a retired anthropologist and folklorist, had moved to the area in hopes of a quiet death. He found something else instead. When shown Elijah's sketches, he didn't blink. He didn't ask questions. He simply whispered, "It's her again." Bloom had seen the symbol once before, etched into a stone in Romania, buried in the crypt of a monastery that burned down in 1892. The monks had no record of the carving, but they all refused to speak when asked about it. Now, decades later, the same shape appeared from the hand of a mute boy in Utah. Bloom asked Elijah only one question. "Did she speak to you?" Elijah didn't move, but after a long silence, he picked up a pencil and wrote a single sentence on the edge of a book. "She said her mouths were hungry." That night, Bloom suffered a seizure. He was found the next morning, face down in his study, eyes wide open, every bone in his hands shattered, as if he'd tried to claw something invisible from his own flesh. He had written one final note before dying: "Do not feed her memory. Do not remember her name." But by then it was too late. Elijah already had. After Dr. Bloom's death, Elijah Turner disappeared for 3 days. The town mobilized. Volunteers combed the woods, drained irrigation ditches, and searched every outbuilding within 5 miles. His mother, already worn thin by years of fear, collapsed during a church vigil. Authorities feared the worst, that he'd wandered into the desert and succumbed to the heat, or worse, been taken. But on the 3rd morning, just before sunrise, Elijah was found, standing perfectly still, right in front of the chapel. His eyes were open, but blank. His lips, dry and cracked, moved without sound. The sheriff tried to question him, but Elijah didn't respond, not even to his name. When they approached him, he didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stared at the rotting wood of the chapel doors. In his right hand, he held something clutched so tightly it had fused to his skin, a torn page from an old Bible. But it wasn't scripture that covered the paper. It was a single phrase, written in blood: "I will open her again." They sedated him and moved him to a facility in Salt Lake City. Doctors diagnosed him with catatonic schizophrenia, but there were inconsistencies. His brain scans showed strange, rhythmic pulses in the temporal lobe, like a signal, faint but constant, that seemed to spike every night at 3:17 a.m. The lead psychiatrist ordered a recording device installed in Elijah's room. On the 7th night, it captured something, not a voice, not words, but laughter, dry, low and feminine, followed by a whisper in a language that no one on staff could identify. That same night, every electrical system in the hospital wing shut down for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. When the lights returned, Elijah was sitting up, awake, smiling. He asked only one question: "Is the chapel still locked?" Security footage of that night was erased, intentionally, because what happened next made no sense. Elijah stood up, took the nurse's hand, and whispered something in her ear. She nodded. Then she walked calmly out of the room, down the hallway, out the main entrance, and was never seen again. Her name was Miriam Caldwell. She left behind 2 daughters, an unlocked car, and a diary filled with dreams about an open mouth in the earth that called her by name. Miriam Caldwell's disappearance was just the beginning. Within 2 weeks, 5 more staff members at the psychiatric facility either vanished, quit abruptly, or were institutionalized themselves. None gave a clear reason. One nurse, found in a catatonic state in the stairwell, kept repeating a single phrase through cracked lips: "The chapel has no roof, only mouths." Elijah Turner was moved to a high-security ward, but it didn't matter. His influence had already begun to spread, slowly, methodically, like mold seeping through old plaster. The drawings returned, not from Elijah but from other patients. Unconnected men and women who had never met him suddenly began sketching identical images: black suns, faceless figures, churches upside down, mouths with fingers inside. And then there were the dreams. Doctors, janitors, orderlies, even security staff began reporting nightmares of being buried alive beneath the chapel floor, of singing in languages their conscious minds didn't understand, of a presence, female, ancient and insatiably hungry, pressing against their ribs from the inside. The hospital chaplain requested an exorcist. He was denied, but he visited Elijah anyway. Their meeting lasted 13 minutes. There was no shouting, no violence. But when the chaplain emerged, he had pulled out every strand of his own hair. His fingernails were torn, as if he'd been clawing at something behind his eyes. Before he was taken away, he whispered one sentence to the receptionist. "She remembers us because we forgot her." That same week, Elijah began speaking again. Not often, not to anyone in particular, but when he did, the recordings captured something horrifying. His voice echoed, as if another version of it, deeper, older, was buried beneath the sound, rising up like a second throat inside his own. Phonetic experts described it as bifurcated vocalization, somti, hing not found in normal human anatomy. His words were nonsensical, until they weren't. One day, he looked directly at a staff member and said, "Your father buried the book beneath the bell." The man froze. His father had died in 1991. He had, in fact, hidden a sealed box beneath the chapel bell tower, something he'd never told a soul. Inside that box, a journal, and a set of skeletal finger bones wrapped in stained silk. The journal's first line read, "She is not God, she is older than him." The journal was written in a script that, at first glance, resembled 19th century cursive, but linguists from 3 universities couldn't agree on the language. It wasn't English, Latin, or any known cipher. The ink had soaked deep into the old vellum, black at first, but under ultraviolet light it glowed a deep red, as if it had been written in oxidized blood. There were illustrations too, crude but deliberate. A woman without eyes, her mouth stretched into a spiral, a tower of teeth, a bell above a pit, and beneath it all, a tree whose roots coiled like intestines around screaming faces. But one page was translated, just one. It had been written in block letters, in English, separate from the rest. No flourish, no symbolism, just 7 words. "I gave her my daughters. She slept." That entry was dated October 1847, the very month Whitmore's 3rd wife disappeared. By this point, the Utah Historical Society intervened. The chapel site was quietly excavated under the pretense of a preservation effort. What they uncovered beneath the bell tower was a stone chamber sealed in iron. Inside, dozens of mummified remains, all female, most missing the lower jaw. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the bodies. It was the architecture. Each stone had been etched from the inside out. The carvings were fingerprints, thousands of them, pressed into wet stone. From the inside, experts called it impossible. Elijah Turner called it a cradle. He had been silent for days. Then suddenly, while seated in the common room under heavy sedation, he began humming. The melody matched a folk hymn recorded in the 1870s, one known to have originated from the Whitmore homestead. But when compared, Elijah's version had a missing verse. No, not missing, restored. An archivist played both versions overlaid. The result? A perfect choral harmony, a duet, as if one voice had been spurned, lit in 2 and separated by more than a century, male and female, human and not. And at the end of the restored verse, Elijah whispered, "Now she wakes." Security footage shows he did not move his lips. The voice came from inside the wall, and for the first time in over 160 years, the bell above the chapel, long since decommissioned, rang by itself 3 times. And then silence. The sound of the bell was unmistakable. Deep, hollow, measured. 3 chimes spaced exactly 66 seconds apart, a timing that did not match any traditional church bell pattern. The chapel had no electricity, no mechanical means for the bell to ring, and yet it did, precisely as Elijah Turner mouthed the phrase, "Now she wakes." Security guards swept the perimeter. Nothing. No one. The footage was reviewed frame by frame. The bell moved, but the rope remained untouched. Not even a breeze stirred the dust around it. Authorities, unnerved, brought in a structural engineer to examine the tower. The conclusion was chilling. The interior of the bell had been warped from the inside, as if something immense had pressed outward, distorting the metal just enough to shift its resonance. The engineer described it like an exhalation, a breath, except metal doesn't breathe. Within 12 hours, Elijah was gone, not escaped, not transferred, gone. His room was sealed, surveillance was active, but at 2:06 a.m. the camera blinked just once for exactly 0.6666 seconds. When the feed returned, Elijah's bed was empty, sheets undisturbed, window latched, no sign of forced entry, but the floorboards bore a new mark, a perfect circle, burned into the wood, with a smaller ring nested inside it. Those who saw it firsthand described a strange vibration beneath their feet, a thrum, low and constant, like being beneath a cathedral organ tuned to a note no human ear could fully register. That morning, a nurse came forward. She had spoken to Elijah the day before. He'd been lucid, clearer than ever. He had thanked her for the tea she never gave him. He smiled with someone else's teeth, and then he said, "She remembers now. She doesn't forgive." In the aftermath, the Utah Historical Society quietly closed the excavation site. Concrete was poured over the chamber, the bell was removed, and melted down, or so they claimed. But local residents say they still hear it, always in threes, always at night, and always when the moon is black. A final note was found in Elijah's discarded journal, hastily scrawled in pencil. There was never a Mr. Whitmore, only a name they fed her, over and over, until she believed it. And beneath it, scratched so hard it tore the paper, "She is not done." The journal was taken into evidence by federal agents, though no agency ever officially acknowledged involvement. It disappeared during transport. When asked, the lead archivist of the Utah State Records Office simply said, "What journal?" But there were copies. One intern, who had been cataloging artifacts for digital entry, secretly scanned 23 pages. What she found was not linear, not coherent, but something deeper, symbols hidden in margins, references to rituals that predated Mormon migration, and drawings of a figure labeled only as Mother of Iron. Not Mother Mary, not a goddess, not a metaphor. She was something older, bound, forgotten, buried. According to Elijah's sketches, each of Mr. Whitmore's wives was selected not randomly, but ritually. He referred to them as the vessels of convergence, 4 women chosen for their ancestral lines, each traced back to a different migration group that crossed into the American West between 1790 and 1830. Each carried a bloodline unrecorded in national census records, but present in obscure European church registries. These were not coincidences. They were calculations. Elijah claimed that Mr. Whitmore was only a name, a mask, a mechanism to center the ritual around a male presence, so that the real force, the she beneath the ritual, would remain hidden. It worked for over a century, until 1847, when one of the wives, Miriam III, attempted to escape. Her body was never found, but beneath the chapel ruins, a bone fragment was uncovered. Female, estimated age 27, the same age Miriam would have been the year of her disappearance. It had teeth marks, human, multiple sets. And the fragment itself, hollowed almost surgically, as if the marrow had been carefully removed, not by tools but suction. No known instrument matched the precision. Elijah's final claim in the journal was chilling. Miriam was not killed. She was emptied, and she remains the only one who remembered. The intern who scanned the pages vanished 2 months later. Her laptop was recovered in a Salt Lake City hotel, password protected, wiped clean, except for one folder titled simply, "Don't Open." Inside it, a single audio file. 27 seconds long, a woman's voice, whispering, repeating the same phrase. "The fourth is coming. The fourth is coming. The fourth is..." The file ends in static. The timestamp, 2:06 a.m. The discovery of the audio file created a brief ripple among underground archivists, those who collect the lost, forbidden, and quietly erased pieces of American history. But few dared to circulate it. One man did, a former anthropology professor from Boulder, dismissed for disruptive teachings. He uploaded the file onto a dark web forum reserved for fringe historical theory. It stayed online for precisely 4 minutes and 13 seconds. Then the forum was taken down. All mirrors, all backups. The administrator's final message before deletion read only, "It's not a voice, it's a key." Several who listened to the recording reported identical symptoms: violent migraines, nightmares of burned planes and faceless women standing in the snow. One woman claimed her mirror image blinked before she did. Another, a former sound engineer, isolated the background noise layered beneath the static. It wasn't ambient, it was structured, rhythmic, a cadence matching the Morse code translation of the phrase, "She never left." What "she" meant, no one could agree on. But the timing is what truly disturbed those paying attention, because 6 weeks after the file surfaced, a structure was unearthed on the outskirts of the old Whitmore property. Construction had begun for a new access road, routine excavation. What they hit wasn't stone, it was metal, a sealed hatch, circular, about 5 feet across, no handles, no markings, buried exactly 13 feet below surface level. Military trucks were seen the next morning. No reports were filed. The hatch is now paved over. Elijah's journal, at least the fragments we know of, ended with a single drawing. Not words, not a closing statement, just an image. It showed a woman, tall and thin, standing in what appeared to be a chapel. But the details defied architectural norms. Walls curved inward, altar inverted, symbols floating in the air. Like smoke rings, her eyes were blackened out, her hands open, and beneath her feet 4 small figures, children, on their knees, heads bowed. The caption beneath, "When the fourth rises, the blood returns to salt," and the silence breaks. Some say it refers to a prophecy, others say it's madness, but those who've studied the deeper layers of American spiritual fringe histories know such phrasing isn't metaphor, it's instruction, and it was never meant for outsiders. The story of Mr. Whitmore and his 4 wives was never meant to be remembered. That's how true power works, not by grand displays or public executions, but by precise surgical erasure. What we've uncovered here is not just a tale of polygamy or isolation or madness, it's a blueprint, a glimpse into the machinery that turns men into myths, women into vessels, and families into instruments of something far older than the church, older than the republic, older than even language. The Utah Territory in 1847 was not simply a place of expansion, it was a threshold, a liminal zone where the rules could be rewritten by those bold or mad enough to challenge the divine order. Whitmore wasn't just a husband to 4 wives. He was the architect of a psychic ritual that, by all surviving accounts, succeeded. Not in bringing peace, but in opening something. A channel. A line of inheritance that still flickers beneath the soil, beneath the towns built atop the ruins, beneath the polite silence of those who know and will not speak. Today, the land where the Whitmore homestead once stood is fenced off by a private security firm with no listed corporate registration. The official line, environmental cleanup, but satellite imagery shows no trucks, No movement, just a perimeter of black gravel and a central structure that emits no heat signature. Locals say the birds avoid it. Dogs will not go near. But here's the question that no one dares to ask aloud. If Elijah Whitmore succeeded in his ritual, if he truly communed with something unspeakable, then where is it now? The answer is simpler than you think. It's not in a tomb, not in a sealed vault, not buried beneath symbols and concrete. It's in the silence, passed down, whispered, embedded in the DNA of a bloodline that refuses to die, and every few decades it surfaces again, briefly, terribly, before slipping back beneath the surface, waiting for the next host, the next house, the next tragedy to open the door again. Some truths aren't meant to be studied, some doors aren't meant to be unlocked, but once you've heard the voice behind the silence, you never stop listening.